Hello, folks. Welcome to another edition of Inside the Marble Palace, Post Media Saskatchewan's look at the goings-on in the Saskatchewan legislature. I am Murray Mandrick, political columnist for the Regina Leader Post and the Saskatoon Star Phoenix. Joining me, Jeremy Symes, our new political reporter at the legislature for the Regina Leader Post. Hello, Jeremy. Welcome to your second edition. Good.
Yeah.
And Zach Vasara, who I have just absolutely given up trying to pronounce his name correctly. My apologies, Zach. Zach is a reporter for the Star Phoenix in Saskatoon that does a little bit of everything, but a lot of great stuff, as he did this week in relation to COVID stories and the goings on at the SHA. Hello, Zach. How you doing?
Hey, Murray, you're saying my name differently every time now. Like it's
One of them's
like
going to be right, huh?
randomized.
I
Eventually,
think
you're gonna get there by trial and error. Eventually, it's just going to happen.
that's my career, buddy. I pretty much got there by trial and error. I'm going to start with you. Speaking of trial and error, or at least the trials of the COVID-19 numbers right now, they're bad. But here's the good news that people always look forward to hearing. We're not seeing deaths yet. We're seeing a rise in hospitalizations, but arguably not as dramatic as other provinces. The premier, certainly in his Facebook post and Twitter post yesterday, made a huge point about this from his home, I assume, in Shelbrook, where he's still recovering from COVID-19 himself. Since our last episode, he's contacted it. What, sir, do you make of the numbers right now, specifically in relation to the two arguments? The premier's argument that it won't be bad, the Omicron wave won't be as bad as we have previously seen, and therefore there is no need to close things down too dramatically. However, there's the other argument that these are just lagging indicators, and what we are seeing right now is sort of an inevitability. Certainly, it seems like there's less of a percentage of Omicron cases causing hospitalizations, ICU admissions compared to Delta, but I'll still let you start there.
Well, I think it depends what your benchmark of success here is. The premier and the health minister were very clear in the fourth wave that their goal was to not overwhelm the healthcare system by having more patients than our limited numbers of staff could physically care for. And they failed because we had to send 30 of our people almost 30 Saskatchewan residents to Ontario for ICU care, right? It didn't work. It was a failure. We can say that. In this wave, the nature of the Omicron variant is that it spreads more readily than Delta, but doesn't seem to cause as severe disease. But the problem is that we're still going to see a lot of hospitalizations, especially in people who have some kind of underlying medical condition or frailty. The way Dr. Chop described this yesterday is that it might tip the balance, for example, in people who have things like diabetes, who are immunocompromised, for example. And that's a lot of people. Let's be clear. There's a lot of people with a quote unquote pre-existing condition in Saskatchewan. Right now, in terms of the numbers, we actually got the numbers in advance this morning as of 7 a.m. Before they are officially released. So I can tell you right now that there are 200 Saskatchewan residents in hospital right now with COVID-19.
Wow, that's dramatic.
That number has gone up considerably over the past week. I think it's kind of doubled essentially over the last week. In terms of the known case total, and let's be clear, this is a vast underestimate because it doesn't include all those rapid tests that everyone is using in Saskatchewan. We know that more than 12,000 people in Saskatchewan are actively sick with COVID-19, which, by the way, means roughly 1 in 100, pardon me, people in this province are known to have COVID. That's never happened before. That's just a dramatic toll of COVID-19. The good news, I guess, if you want to look at it as good news.
I just stop you there, Zach, because there's significance in that number, because that includes medical professionals, nurses, doctors, hospital staff, and it's something that's not being talked about enough, I think. So maybe you can explain the stress on the health system.
Totally. And I think this is where there's a huge disconnect between the issues being discussed online and the issues that people are actually seeing on the ground. The problem really is not that our ICUs are going to be overwhelmed like in the fourth wave. The problem is that Omicron will cause so much disruption that it will cause a lot of pain for the healthcare system that's already been through it. So we know, for example, that hundreds and hundreds of healthcare workers are testing positive and thus cannot go into work. The SHA's policy is that healthcare workers can't go to work for 7 days after they test positive, relative to the 5 days in the general population. We don't have exact numbers on how many of them are sick, but we're told it's a very significant uptick, way higher than it ever was in the Delta wave. And we were told quite plainly yesterday by the SHA that this might require them to pause surgeries and other essential services again, which is a huge setback for the healthcare system. So the premier's argument basically is that so far we haven't seen the kind of punishing ICU numbers that we saw in the fourth wave. Yes, things are going okay. On the other side, we have our chief medical health officer, Dr. Shahab, saying, look, listen, hospitalizations are going to go up for weeks. And we have the SHA saying this is a public health emergency and it's going to disrupt access to care. So that's the landscape right now here, Murray.
Jeremy, how is this playing out in terms of public reaction to what's going on right now? We obviously see it on social media, which really isn't much of a measure of anything other than partisan viewpoints back and forth. But there has been Angus Reid polling. There has been other polling. Can you speak to that, Jeremy, in terms of what it is like for Premier Scott Moe right now in the public reaction compared to maybe this summer when everything after the reopening seemed to meet general public approval?
Right, for sure. So recent polling from Angus Reid showed that these lack of measures may suggest that it's working against the premier in a way right now with how he's responding to the pandemic. So the poll found that 59% people said, respondents said he was doing a bad job handling the pandemic. Now, if we compare this to July, there was 32% that said he was doing a bad job then. So we're seeing more people say he's doing a bad job. On the flip side, you're seeing 37% saying he's doing a good job in January. But if you compare that to July, there were 66% that said he was doing a good job then. So Angus Reid took that all together and said, yeah, maybe these lack of measures, this lack of, I guess, commitment to doing some action on things could be hurting the premier politically. Obviously, the premier has doubled down on his response, saying, what we're doing in Saskatchewan here is working. Like Zach mentioned, pointing to other jurisdictions, we're not seeing that here yet, so we're sticking to what we're doing. And I guess just on top of that, they looked at the premier's approval rating as well. They found his approval rating is 45%. That's a slight uptick from 43% that we saw in July, but it's quite the downfall from, in October it was 43%, but quite the downfall from July where it was about 61%. So,
and there might be non-COVID issues related to that I hope we have time to get into in relation to the announcement this week that you covered it related to the canola crushing plan. But before we leave this notion, I'm kind of curious, and I'm struggling a little bit to understand completely the driving factors. One of them obviously has to be what's going on, not just in hospitals, but in schools, because parents are very frustrated with that. We're seeing in Regina, in Yorkton, in other places, schools and whole entire school divisions now being closed, at least temporarily, because of the extreme number of cases right now. I think a little bit is everything is similar to what Zach was talking about. We're losing teachers and people are staying home sick and kids are staying home sick, so it's less productive right now. But is there any indication, Jeremy, from polling results that in terms of what the core frustrations are related to the premier and the government's handling of Omicron? Because that would certainly seem to be one of the topical matters that I'm seeing right now. Obviously, not everybody has kids in school, but if you do, it becomes a big issue when the kids have to stay home because either they're sick or the parents are worried about them being sick.
Right, absolutely. So in terms of the core and the polling, I guess all that Angus Reid could say is that, him not doing something, not having any measures, maybe having an impact. That's all they're saying on that front. But like you said, with schools and teachers, and even to Zach's point about, people working in the health center, teachers are frustrated, they're exhausted, there's a bit of anxiety there right now. So perhaps those frustrations could be bleeding over in a way. It's not so much, say, with the premier's not doing anything, but people are getting sick and, they can't work. And then that's whole other subset of issues there. But yeah, I mean, yeah, lots of cases right now in schools. Regina Public reported 526 self-reported cases, with 53 school staff having those. Saskatoon, similar situation is playing out. Public schools, 119 cases. Catholics, some self-reported of a little over 1,300, which seems like quite a bit. And so a lot of schools are going online to, I guess, avoid the transmission. So substitute teachers can work, and teachers can still do their jobs effectively. And there's enough of them there for students.
Zach, you did a couple of stories that I found absolutely fascinating this week. One of which was talking somewhat about how the ongoing nature of this pandemic sort of feeds into people's frustrations, maybe political divisions. And the second story was related to maybe the government's response to this, because we've seen a major development in terms of the SHA appointing a person in Raynell Wilson, who is experienced in government. And she has considerable experience in government now, because she's been pretty much with the government since the very beginning, after running as a Sask Party candidate in 2007, as a government insider, being appointed to an SHA position. How do you tell us a bit about this story, first of all, how it's playing out, and maybe, if you can, how that might feed into the overall frustration with the Sask Party, Premier Scott Moe government, in terms of its response to the public?
Sure. So I'll start with a bit of an overlay of the story for our listeners who don't know. The Raynell Wilson is a longtime political operative for the Saskatchewan Party government. She was a candidate in 2007. She was a chief of staff at one point under Donna Harpower, who's of course now the deputy premier, and she went on to serve in a number of roles that are appointed by order in council. Right, these are signed off by the premier. They're
political jobs, yeah.
They're political patronage appointments.
Yeah.
And we started to hear back in December, shortly after the departure of Saskatchewan Health Authority CEO Scott Livingston, which was very sudden and very unexpected, that it had to do with political meddling in the Saskatchewan Health Authority. Now, what we then later found out was that the issue was Raynell Wilson being appointed to a vice president role in the SHA. And for listeners who don't know, the reason that's unusual is that while the minister appoints the oversight board of the SHA, usually going into the actual executive of the organization is seen as kind of a no-no. There's a sort of church and state divide there, that the SHA is apolitical, and you don't go inserting political patronage jobs into the healthcare system. But Raynell Wilson was seconded to that role from another role that was especially created for her by order in council in the Ministry of Health. And what my sources inside the SHA were telling me was that this was basically seen as a power play to expand political influence within the SHA. And why this is relevant maybe to the pandemic is because we've seen over the course of the pandemic discord between the SHA and government. We've seen, for example, healthcare leaders in the SHA say something very clearly that government did not like, that went against government's message, which typically has favored less stringent societal restrictions in favor of more business autonomy and free public movement. There were moments in the fourth wave where the Minister of Health would say, I think things are fine. And then Scott Livingston, then the CEO, would say, hospitals are on the brink of being overwhelmed. So I think for many people, while this might not 100% come down to that, that connection was hard to ignore. And certainly it kind
That's fascinating to me.
Yeah,
that's absolutely fascinating to me, because people often wonder why we write stories and I do columns about what generally is referred to as inside baseball, stuff related to political appointments, stuff related to the goings on in politics, which, I don't know if you guys noticed it, but I'm a little old. Been doing this for a while. Yeah.
No, you're a spring chicken, Murray. A spring chicken.
I'm a fried chicken at this point. But in that regard, I have seen governments, NDP, Sask Party, Progressive Conservative, because that's how far back I go, always appoint political appointees to certain roles. There's always the controversy when they get into roles that are related to government. Now, most people don't see it or think about it, but I think you just put your finger on what people instinctively and fundamentally know and understand. When the decisions of government become rather politicized, sorry, they basically look for why that is happening. Maybe one of the reasons why that is happening is because the government is listening to itself too much by doing the things in the past. I saw the NDP government do it, by the way. By the end of their term, they were actually appointing political staff from executive council, where Ms. Wilson once worked, to basically spy on people working in the Crowns to see what they were up to see if they were basically following orders, the old Soviet commissars things. I heard that term revisited after your story today, this week, or last week, I'm sorry. Is that fundamentally what you're sensing right now? Because your story has received a significant amount of reaction, and I'm kind of curious as to why the public has picked up on it in a way maybe that they haven't in the past.
I think that's definitely part of it. This idea that there has been a line fundamentally crossed in terms of the autonomy of the Saskatchewan Health Authority, right? This isn't just a Crown Corporation too, right? This isn't something like that. This is the healthcare system for basically all of Saskatchewan. It is something that is so fundamental to people's lives and very much in the spotlight more than it ever has been because of the pandemic. So people are really paying attention. And when you have a high-profile departure followed by this kind of political appointment, I think a lot of people's conclusion is that that kind of stinks and something is going on there for sure. I think maybe another reason why people really clued into this might have had something to do with government's response to our story, where they basically said nothing to see here. Mm-hmm. But when I asked the Minister of Health very clearly, did Scott Livingston express misgivings about any potential appointment of Raynell Wilson to the Health Authority? When I asked him this multiple times, he wouldn't answer the question and he wouldn't say yes or no. And the CBC also interviewed him, similar response there. And I think that also just set off alarm bells in people's minds, because if it, it's not like it's a private HR conversation. It's asking, the minister if someone told him something. He could have said no, and that might have dispelled this reporting and at least counteracted it. But in essence, he didn't really deny it, which is what makes this kind of an interesting story to me.
It certainly is, and I think it's one of the real driving forces that we're seeing in relation to those polls right now, where, as Jeremy outlined, the Premier is not doing very well on COVID-19. However, interestingly, his popularity doesn't seem to be suffering that much because on other issues that are not related to COVID-19, and possibly because people are liking the general direction of this particular government right now. Now, you talked about that earlier, Jeremy, and you probably did a story that maybe addresses that phenomenon a little bit better than most people understand, and that was the story in relation to the canola crushing plant. Why is that such good news for Premier Scott Moe right now, beyond the fact that it's a political distraction? It actually is a pretty good news story in terms of what this plant will bring to the province. Can you just sort of talk about that briefly?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the good news for the government there is it's another big investment in the province. It's $4.5 billion in economic boost to Saskatchewan, and the Sask party is all about bringing jobs or wanting to bring jobs and saying we are the party that, we're here for the economy, we're here for jobs, etc. So when you have this $2 billion announcement come on board, you're going to take advantage of that in a way. But on top of that, there's a bunch of canola crushing facilities happening in Saskatchewan right now that are planning to be built.
Planning was just critical, right?
Yeah, planning. So there's this is just another one on top of, I think, another 4 or 5. So yeah, so I guess it's good news for them in that sense. But to the plant, $2 billion is going to turn canola into biodiesel at the refinery here, or near the refinery here in Regina. It'll crush this canola and use that meal for some value-added agriculture products. So it kind of speaks to the heart of Saskatchewan's economy and kind of taking it to that next step too.
And when you speak to the heart of the Saskatchewan economy, really you're speaking to the heart of Saskatchewan politics, which is a large rural base that really, I think, generally wants to see what's been going on in healthcare, what's been going on in COVID over, as does everyone in this province, I imagine, and wanting us to see us move forward. So as we wrap up this conversation today and leave, are we generally seeing the light at the end of the tunnel? And maybe I'll leave that start with you, Zach, in terms of of where we're at, because we really don't know where we're going to go with this Omicron wave and how bad it's going to get. Is there that light at the end in the tunnel, or is it the proverbial train coming if we get slammed with as many COVID cases and hospitalizations as you talked about at the start of this show?
I'm going to quote Dr. Saqib Shahab at UMurray and say that what he said, which is that experts have stopped predicting the future, which I thought was very funny and kind of on tune. But I think it's really premature at this point to say what will happen, right? Like, there's a scenario where some of the premier's hunches pay off, and maybe Saskatchewan gets away with a less punishing Omicron wave than other parts of Canada because we went through our Delta wave back in the fall and we're, in a better position than other provinces when they started. That could happen. We could also be in a scenario where we're hit as bad as other provinces and we see massive setbacks in healthcare. What happens after all of that, I think, is really going to just be a matter of time. Maybe Omicron recedes and that truly is the end of COVID-19, at least as a pandemic. And we now think about that as being an endemic disease going forward that we can manage with medications and with vaccinations. Or maybe, and this is what virologists talk about all the time, Omicron won't be the last variant potentially, right? This thing could just mutate again. The next letter in the Greek alphabet is pi. So look out for that. And maybe the pi variant comes along and it's like Omicron. It doesn't really care about previous infection with other variants. And this whole goat and pony show starts all over again.
So, which is problematic right now in terms of where we might be going. And we really don't know. We have a by-election right now, Jeremy. We called for the northern riding of Athabasca. I don't think that'll be really telling us too much other than what might happen in that northern riding. Can you tell us why, Jeremy?
We have the by-election up there. We'll see. Previously, an NDP seat, and his name escapes me. I'm very sorry. He was
Buckley Blanchet.
Yes, sorry. Still
you never forget him.
I know, right? I know. Yeah. So, we'll see how that goes. I don't know, Murray, if you think that might still be an NDP stronghold in a way, but
I think it traditionally has been. So it probably, the problem with any individual by-elections is it doesn't really tell us too much about anything other than what may be going on in that riding and maybe in the political climate at the time. But it'll be yet another reason for intrigue, and I guess to continue watching Inside the Marble Palace for more updates. I thank you both, Zach and Jeremy, for your input today and your insight. And please, I hope you join us again soon in terms of Inside the Marble Palace, Zach. And I'll see you next week, Jeremy.
Yeah.
Take care, guys.
Bye.